Up next, to discuss free speech on campus, please welcome Robert Zimmer, President of the University of Chicago. Here to lead the conversation, please welcome the Atlantic's Editor-in-Chief, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Let me just thank you once again on behalf of the Atlantic for coming out this morning. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming in from Beijing. Just for this.
Just for this.
Returning right again. Right? So let me jump right in and ask you how you became the Mario Savio of the free speech, of the university president's free speech movement. And what I mean by that is, how did this become a controversial idea again, that universities should be places that value free speech?
Yeah, well, I think one thing to look at is the fact that the questions about free speech and whether this is something that needs to be valued and is critical has been challenged regularly, and there's not been any period where there's nobody challenging this. And that's true in universities as well as it's true in society. So the idea that we're at a unique point in time, I think, is not right, but what we are at is a period of quite pronounced challenge to this. It's not unique, but it is very pronounced.
Could I ask, there's a very short video that we should watch. Can I ask that video to be queued up? It's a scene from Middlebury College recently. Is that possible?
Charles Murray, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Charles Murray, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Charles Murray, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Charles Murray, go away! Racist, sexist.
That was a Charles Murray visit to Middlebury where he was, quote, no platformed, I guess. And it ended in a pretty ugly scene that led to an injury of a professor. Talk about that. Is that something that's new that you're seeing, or is that also something that has erupted periodically?
Well, again, I think these things erupt periodically, and I think if you look at this particular case and you just look at what you saw in the film, if this had been taking place outside the room, if it would have been taking place as a protest that was not disruptive of somebody's capacity to speak and other people's capacity to listen, it would have been totally fine and a natural expression of free speech itself. And so that type of protest in the right context is perfectly normal and acceptable. The difficulty with that is that it was actually preventing somebody from speaking and people from hearing him. I mean, one needs to remember that when speakers are disrupted, you're not just talking about the speaker, you're talking about the people who came to hear that person.
Right. Well, talk about one of the things you've done is you've spoken out against trigger warnings, and you've basically told the students at University of Chicago, here's your one trigger warning. You're going to read things and hear things that are going to make you upset. Deal with it. Talk about how you came to that view, and then I want to ask you about the possible downsides of that view. Yeah.
So first, from the point of view of delivering a quality education, everybody needs to learn how to be challenged, to challenge their own assumptions, to challenge others, to understand arguments when they work, when they don't work. They need to learn how to think. And the only way you do that is through this intellectual challenge and through this constant up and back of discourse. So for us, all of this is about the nature of the quality of education that we're offering students. And I would say that at a period in which one started seeing so many people being disinvited from speaking, we felt it was really necessary to put out a statement that made clear the nature of what the University of Chicago has always held as intrinsic to the nature of the high quality of its education.
The critique comes from students from marginalized communities, first-generation students, and so on, is that it's easy for you to say this racist speaker should be allowed to speak, but the university is also a community. and you're obliged to make members of your community feel safe. And it is true that even the University of Chicago has safe spaces. You have an LGBTQ safe space on your website, and you have all kinds of things that you do for that community. So how do you respond, and I'm sure you've been challenged on this by students, how do you respond to the demand that, hey, this is not a purely intellectual exercise being part of this university. We're also here together, and you have some obligation to make us feel comfortable.
Yeah, so I think that there's no question that one needs to have an environment in which the difficulties of dealing with all sorts of behaviors, all sorts of speech, all sorts of expression are addressed, and that students are able to talk about it, they're helped with it, one can articulate whatever you want about it. There's no question that that needs to be done. But the response to that is not to say we're going to limit the quality of everybody's education, including every student, by undermining what is a fundamental methodology for actually having a good education.
Is the student body at University of Chicago self-selected in the sense that people who come there understand what they're getting into, as opposed to, I don't want to name other campuses,
Yeah.
but you know the names.
Yeah. I would say to some extent, but not 100%. So I think that there are students and faculty who raise the question as to whether the stance that I've articulated is the right one, and that's fine. I mean, one should talk about discourse like one talks about everything else. But I do think that there are many students who appreciate and are proud of that particular environment, and the same with faculty. There's nothing one can say on the campus of the University of Chicago that everybody is going to agree with. Just that such a statement doesn't exist, except maybe for that statement.
Right. Well, here's something that everybody would agree on. Richard Spencer is a racist, right? Everybody at University of Chicago, I assume, would say Richard Spencer is a racist. Would you have Richard Spencer come speak at the university?
Right. So the way to understand this, and I'll answer it very directly in a second, but the way people get to speak at the University of Chicago is that they're invited by a faculty member or they're invited by a student group. And it's our policy that in a spirit of creating an open, unchilled environment that's going to produce the most engaged and empowering education and the right environment for a research environment that creates imaginative thought, that having faculty and having students have that capacity is a key part of that. It's a way of them saying, I want to hear what this person has to say, I want to challenge them, I want to agree with them, I want other people to challenge them, but the capacity of students and faculty to invite people is how people get to campus. We're not a public institution, we're not subject to the First Amendment. No one has a right to walk onto campus and say, I'm exercising my right to speak at the University of Chicago. Richard Spencer cannot walk onto campus and claim that he's exercising a right that doesn't exist, just like no one else can. On the other hand, if a faculty member invited him or a student group invited him, he would be able to speak.
And you would support them?
I would support the privilege of the people who invited them to invite who they want.
I want to talk about other campuses, and feel free to name names also. But your attitude is markedly different from leadership at certain other schools that believe that free speech and community exist in some kind of tension. Talk about, and I don't want to turn this into a Kids Today discussion, although that would be the name of my column if I had one, kids. But what, from your perspective, where have things gone a bit sideways? I mean, I've had conversations, you've had conversations with people in their teens, 20s, who don't know much about the First Amendment. When they hear about the First Amendment, we hear about the tradition of free speech, say, so what? There are other equities involved. So trace the course of this a little bit. How have we gotten to this point?
Well, I think what one sees all the time is when you get issues around which people are very passionate and very emotional, very committed, there tends to be a way of saying this is more important than other sorts of principles. And it's particularly the case when the other principles really demonstrate their value over time rather than being so evident in a particular moment. So if you look at free expression, it's demonstrated its value over time. And for people to appreciate that, they actually need to know a little history, and they need to understand what it's there for, and they need to understand from the point of view of an education why this is a part of an education. Now, these are things that one needs to understand. They're not just immediately obvious. And so when one is faced with a internal drive around which one is exceedingly passionate and committed, it's very easy to say, well, what I care about is more important than the First Amendment. The big naivete in all of that is the assumption that when somebody's deciding who's actually going to be able to speak, is that you're going to be the one who decides, and that is an exceedingly naive assumption.
So the argument is that since no one can actually, I can define your speech as hate speech, you can define mine as hate speech, therefore, let's just allow speech to happen because it's impossible otherwise.
Well, so that's a type of First Amendment argument. For us, it's really an argument based on the nature of education and the nature of an intellectual.
Right. But come back to this question of other universities.
Yeah.
I'm not asking you to cast aspersions on
Yeah.
people, but
Yeah.
But there are other universities whose presidents and faculties have instituted different kinds of ideas about speech and the value of speech versus the value of, I guess they would say in some sort of neutral way, community.
Yeah.
From your perspective, where have they gone wrong, and why did they go down this path where free speech is no longer an absolute notion in a university setting?
Yeah. So
Or near
I would say that it's very interesting to get people to articulate what are they fundamentally about. Are you fundamentally about delivering an education? And what does that education mean? What are you trying to accomplish? What is the nature of it? And how are you going to get there? And let me give you one example of how these things go awry. I asked one person, a faculty member at another university, how are you thinking about free expression? And the answer I got was, my first concern is safety. And I said, well, okay, of course safety is important, but that would be like my asking you, what is the science agenda for your university? How are you thinking about developing science and applied science at your university? And the answer is, my first concern is lab safety. Well, of course you're concerned about lab safety, but do you actually have any principles about the nature of the education you're offering and what's entailed in delivering that education? So I think that there are places that could sharpen up their view about that.
That was extremely diplomatic.
I also say, on the other hand, not everybody needs to want to offer the type of rigorous education that we do. In which case, you ought to be honest about what it is you're delivering. You don't have to say, our fundamental mission is to deliver the most empowering education we can to our students who are going to learn how to think and apply that to whatever complex challenges they face in their future. You don't have to say that.
I want to take one or two questions in a moment, but just while you're thinking of your questions, let me ask you this. And I know this from the history of the Atlantic. If you looked at the Atlantic 80 or 100 years ago, university presidents were regularly writing what we now refer to as cover stories, not about education, but about the great issues of the day. You're a veteran university president, major American institution. University presidents are no longer moral or political leaders in the way that they once were. What happened along the way that made this job, in most cases, smaller than it used to be?
Well, I think I'd give two angles to that. And let me sort of give one angle which I think is something of a positive, and one angle which is perhaps something of a negative. So let me tell you that sort of the way I've thought about that in terms of my own activity, which is that I'm very comfortable, as I am here, speaking about things that have to do with higher education or the University of Chicago and so on. Offering simply views about things that are not connected to any of those things, in a way, I would argue, creates a somewhat challenging internal environment. Because part of what we always want to do is create this maximally non-chilled environment for discourse. And if you imagine yourself as an assistant professor who's writing something about that has some sort of implications, and the president of the university has now taken this stand about something that doesn't have to do with the president's job, just has to do with general conversation, how does that make you feel? Does that chill that environment or not? So in one way, I, unlike some of my predecessors, not my recent predecessors, but Robert Maynard Hutchins is certainly an example, have taken the willingness to talk forcefully about universities and higher education as part of my job, but very specifically to be very careful about talking about other things because of the nature of creating a non-maximally chilled environment. You know, on the other hand, you can look at that as a positive or negative. You can agree with it or disagree with it, but that's an argument. I do think these jobs have become very complicated with large numbers of constituencies, and people are trying to stay focused on getting done important things with respect to their institution. Now, again, you can agree or disagree with what they're doing, but I do think that people look at this as a better use of their voice is to advance their institution than to be yet another commentator on political issues.
Over here, thank you. We're going to go behind the pole here. Could you stand up? Thank you. And please ask these questions in the form of a question. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. My name is Chris. I teach at Abraham Lincoln High School here in the city.
Could you move over one step so I could see you?
Thank
you.
My disembodied voice.
We're depriving your right to free speech here with a poll.
Yeah. So I teach government and economics to seniors, and I brought 50 of my students here today. And you're talking about the environment on college campuses. The environment on a high school campus is very different than a college campus. So they don't really know kind of what's going on. They might have seen it on the news. But I'm wondering if you have any advice for questions that they might ask themselves, and then questions about the institutions to which they're currently applying, to sort of figure out what the environment is and whether that's the best one for them to pursue their education.
Right. So, well, I'm not going to surprise you that I have a very strong feeling about the importance of an environment that's open to intellectual challenge in a university or college. And I would say that if I were a high school student, I would want that type of environment. And why? Because it's actually going to empower me to do things for the rest of my life in a much stronger way than different types of environments. Now, so that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that I think high schools are in a tricky spot because, as you say, the environment in a high school can't be the same as that on a college campus. On the other hand, I think it's very important that high schools prepare students for the type of open, challenging, and intellectually rigorous environment that I'm talking about. Now, I'm not a high school educator. I'm not pretending how to balance the developmental issues with the intellectual issues that high schools are always dealing with, and you have people who are developing quickly from 9th grade to 12th grade. But I think it's very important that high schools actually think through and purposefully take on this question of, are we doing a good job? The way we're doing a good job in preparing people to write a history paper or to take calculus or advanced calculus course, very thoughtful, very purposeful. Are we purposefully preparing our high school students to flourish in an intellectually challenging environment, or are we preparing them to need a kind of protection and intellectual safety, which is, college is not the moment for, as far as I'm concerned?
What he's trying to say is you should all apply to the University of Chicago. By the way. I'm sorry that we've run out of time. I would love to take more questions, but we've run out of time. But thank you very, very much for coming, and thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.